Our topic today is how investors view regulatory systems. Welcome, Professor Cleveland Jones. This is his profile. He's
Great to be with you again, Gilad.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Consultant in the oil industry, is a partner of NXT, and of course is a famous consulting of geopolitical and oil industry, energy industry at all. So before we begin with your slides, I would like to suggest some questions or points, key points that I would like to be covered, if you can cover during your presentation. The first point for me is how different are regulatory systems around the world in different countries, if you can compare countries. What variables investors look for? Uh, if companies reserve money to be protected from change in the regulatory system in countries. The question, that's a very tricky question, is lobbying a common tool used by large companies to influence regulations? I'm not sure, but you can
Yeah.
clarify for us, of course. And uh, uh, and for renewable energy, what are you seeing to renewable energy compared to the old-fashioned energy that we just have something
Very
that's
good questions.
established,
I
well
think that
established?
we should keep them in mind as we talk a little bit about some of these slides, Gilad.
Yeah, perfect.
Uh,
So please go ahead
yeah,
with your.
let me just share.
Mhm.
Here. We should be on sharing. It's taking it. Yeah. Um, you know the question that comes up a lot when we talk about regulatory systems, the environment for companies to operate in, and so on, is that everything has to be looked at from a scenario that covers the world. Because companies don't just invest in Canada, Australia, or Indonesia. They have a choice. Most major companies have a choice of where to invest. So it's very important to keep an eye on the global situation. And in that sense, there's a lot of services that conduct, geopolitical assessments for regulations, for legislation, for risks, for this, that, and the other. And in particular, for example, this brings up some ESG related issues. Now, ESG is not necessarily something that is positive for a company to have in terms of legislative concerns, but it's important in the sense that, to some extent, governance is a very big concern for all companies. There's governance from the corporate point of view as well as governance from the government point of view. And this is an assessment that I think precedes a lot of the other assessments. And then, of course, we know that Western Europe, the U.S., and so on have relatively advanced systems in place. So in that score, you can feel comfortable if you're a company considering investment decisions. But there's a lot of light areas or completely white areas that show that it's very difficult to even begin to consider investment decisions when you don't have the underlying uh, general system to provide some security for decisions.
But
Um,
in this case, Brazil is in a better situation than the United States.
uh, uh, because Brazil actually has a good uh, regulatory framework for ESG
Yeah,
regulations. The U.S. is not that it's a bad environment, but the U.S. is up until recently has chosen not to focus on ESG as a requirement. It actually has backtracked in some states, as you know. So this
California.
probably hurt that rating. But again, I'm saying this is a precursor to more investment decisions. So if you have very light areas or white areas, maybe you have to be concerned. If the situation in the United States is that ESG is nowadays contested in some states, and that's fine with companies. They can continue to pursue ESG performance criteria on their own. But like I said, this is just a first assessment. Then you look at something that I think is even more important: rule of law. Rule of law is what makes you believe that a country is where you can enter into partnerships or associations or contracts with the government, with other partners, and what you write down, what you negotiate, will be what is done, because the rule of law says that you make contracts and so on. And on that score, things are a lot different, because on that score, many countries fail because they have less developed historical groundwork for a rule of law. In a lot of more recent democracies, and we spoke about this last time about Africa, for example. Africa has a lot of young countries recently established. We're talking young, 20, 30 years is young, to establish the framework for a legal system that can be shown to be lasting and reliable. That is a long process. So that is a much more fundamental question that I think should worry companies when they look at an attractive investment opportunity, but it happens to be in Southeast Asia or in African countries, or certainly even Mexico. There is I talk about Mexico. Some countries that we would assume are relatively well placed, but in practice, their performance recently has given rise to doubts by the
Yeah.
companies that would make those investments.
The best three countries are Canada, Australia, and Norway, maybe Denmark.
The Nordic countries, yeah, because again, this is more than just the legal framework. This is a lasting legal framework. A legal framework can be fantastic, but if it was enacted last year and you don't know if the Congress or whatever is going to undo everything, then you worry about it. And in fact, that's one of the reasons maybe why the U.S. is not one of the darkest colors, because there is an active movement in the U.S. for a lot of legislative changes. Any changes, even if they're supposedly going to make life better for the corporate world, that is a worrisome sign, because changes should be very well thought out. They should be methodical. They should be planned. They should be a process with significant input from society, from corporate members as well. And in most cases, the Congress gets together and pass a law, increase taxes, reduce taxes, provide incentives. That sounds good, but it also shows you that it can be undone quite quickly. And that's the part. The other part is that what does the rule of law actually entail? Certainly, we talk a lot about government, because when you invest in a country, you have to worry about what the government as a player has to do with the investment. In many cases, you're not dealing with the government, but the government has effect on your regulations, on your licensing, on many other things that affect the investor. But the absence of corruption from the top down, from the government where you will be investing, from the companies in that country, that is an essential concern for reputational risk. And we spoke about that also. Reputational risk nowadays is a very big concern for companies. The companies might be clean and so on. They enter into an agreement with a local enterprise, even if it's a supplier. And then you find out that that supplier is enmeshed in some kind of corruption scheme. That throws the company's name in the dirt. And that's a very big concern, especially for majors in oil and gas, important companies that are setting up, divisions in another country. So that is, I would say, the most critical aspect. Open government, so you understand what's going on, participatory, fundamental rights are protected, not just because people want to have nice social attitudes, but fundamental rights of corporate citizens also. It's not just whether women have equal rights. It's whether a company's right will be protected.
But there are countries that are like pendulums, goes to different opposite positions every 4 years,
Yeah.
like Brazil.
Yeah, that is a big problem. That's, for example, one of the reasons why it was not well colored there, because changes are not positive, especially rapid changes or unexpected or changes that pertain to every time there's a new government elected. You know, those are impairments to democracy, actually, because if you have a changing system, you don't have the strong base. The pyramid has to be built on a strong base. That is one of the main concerns. So fundamental rights and all of these things are legislative. But again, you have to look, are they entrenched? Is something that was enacted last year doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. Order and security, yes. For example, as you mentioned, in Brazil, I have personal acquaintances that were invited to be country managers here in Rio de Janeiro, and they declined because crime is a concern. Security for the family of a country manager. That is especially the case in many Southeast Asian countries, in African countries. I personally was, the target of a problem along those lines. I was much younger, but that happens even at official levels. And if you understand that that is a risk in the country, and that happens by government officials acting as rogue members of society, that can influence a decision, say, hey, we don't want our operatives in that kind of environment.
Professor Cleveland, but stability of something that may be not so good, but stability is something that you can predict. The problem for me is the fluctuation from one side.
No, you can only predict going back. You can't predict towards the future. That is the thing that really gets people. Because you look back in the history of some of the countries that we mentioned, you look back into Mexican history of regulations, back and forth, you can't trust anything. Going forward, we don't know. Maybe it will settle somewhere and go forward. You look at the Nordic countries, they have fantastic record going back. Why might that change? You know, elections recent have shown different trends in voting trends. So that might change. We don't know. So going forward, it's a much riskier situation. And that's why some of these important consulting firms are much more attuned to what are the trends in the Congress, what is this president likely to try to achieve, and so on. So any company considering that has to spend some money on those consultancies. The regulatory enforcement is a big part of it. You know, if you have protections in place, but they're not enforced, it doesn't help a company that establishes operations and all of a sudden it is not able to, in effect, protect its operations because there's no enforcement. We see that to some extent, for example, in environmental laws. Many environmental laws are not enforced. While that might sound good for some companies that don't intend to comply, the companies that do say, why should I be investing in, environmental protection and so on when there's no enforcement? I'm paying for nothing. So those are decisions that affect. Those are conditions that affect the decision. Civil justice, in civil courts, and criminal justice. In some countries, the criminal system, justice system, is very harsh. We've just had notice recently that North Korea executed 30 executives of a ministerial department. They do the same thing to companies that are associated with government projects. If you believe that you will be treated so harshly as to be executed in a country, you will think twice before going in, because everybody can misstep once in a while, and you don't want to be subject to draconian consequences.
Looking from your vision, Brazil in these aspects that are in the screen, how Brazil is?
Brazil is not too bad. But the problem with Brazil and some other Latin American countries, maybe much worse in African countries, is that we don't have the long history of stability. So our current regulatory, even legislative system is relatively amenable for corporate operations. The regulatory framework for operating is a little worse because we'll get to that. One of the aspects that is very important for companies is red tape. And Brazil, of course, has a lot of red tape, as have most South American countries. Some South American countries, like Argentina, have decided, the new president, had decided arbitrarily to reduce some red tape. But that is not necessarily all good because sometimes you cut red tape and you make problems. And this is the other side of the coin of these sudden changes in regulatory environments. But
because
red tape is a big concern.
red tape. For instance, the natural gas recent laws or decrees that are forcing some problems with Petroleum
Yeah.
Institute.
For
So
example,
it's not expected and something that can.
yeah, for a long time, everybody clamored for a legislative
Regulation.
regulation that would apply to natural gas because in some countries like Brazil, natural gas is underutilized, particularly because of regulatory and legislative problems. Bringing in a new system is not a panacea because the new system has a lot of critics, and as of now, many of the provisions of this gas law and so on have problems of being implemented. And well, certainly, you always have winners and losers. And in this case, I think Petrobras is not particularly happy with the legislation, but it will happen in any country. If you have a refinement of the legislative system, if you have the regulatory background that affects the operating of the company, it provides some restrictions for some. It might liberalize things for others, but there's always winners and losers. So this has to be negotiated well and over a longer period of time so that things can be considered settled. Because if you railroad a new law into place because the president has a lot of power over the Congress or something like that in some countries, that is not necessarily a good thing because everybody knows that is something that was pushed and there's always pushback. And next year things can change. So the important thing is, do we have a good operating environment? Yes. Can it last? We'll see. And you don't come in the next year. You wait
But
1 or 2 years and
it
see what
seems
happens.
in this case of natural gas laws, the recent ones, it seems that the interests are so different, and companies, institutions, govern Petrobras. So there is no, let's see, a unique vision for the system. Why?
Exactly, because I think in this case it's clear that there's winners and losers, and the big loser, there's a lot of small winners, but there's a big loser, which is Petrobras, which loses power by having a national legislation that applies to gas when it was able to have basically a monopoly with high prices. Brazilian natural gas prices are very high in relation to averages of the world, and this situation is very detrimental to industry. So if you have legislation which increases competition and makes it easier to bring in gas lines and bring in gas from the pre-salt, for example, the industry will be happy, but Petrobras won't. And then you have a conflict there until it's resolved, including in the courts. You don't have a clear system. You have a new system, but not a clearly defined system. And this is the problem with many regulations. And this is why, for example, some of the consultancies don't just look at this is what the regulation in such a country says. Oh, you need this and that. They look at and say, how stable has this legislation been? This legislation has been there and operating for 5 years and it's worked fine. And in Brazil's case, for example, we can point to the ANP and the bidding rounds having a 20-some year history, very settled, very reliable. That's very positive. for
That's
the
right.
oil and gas industry, for example. But in other respects, not necessarily so.
Mhm.
Particularly as you asked, for example, in renewable energy. And renewable energy is a new game everywhere in the world. So in very few places can you say that that is an established,
Regulatory
system.
system. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's one of the challenges, of course. Um, the other thing is there's things that, for example, risks that affect operations. When the World Economic Forum, we used this slide a while back, uh, pointed out what are the major risks affecting, on a global scale. On the economic side of risks, their risks that they consider were debt crisis, for example. What
Like the
about all
US.
the other economic risks? Sometimes you look at this and you say, this is the World Economic Forum, you know, putting together the giant heads of economists from around the world. And when they talk about economic risk, they talk about debt crisis. What about all the other risks, including regulatory, legislative, corruption, and so on, that affect business conditions? And you see how difficult it is to have a global outlook that is balanced, that
Yeah.
is correct, that is reliable. It's very difficult. I don't mean to come down hard on the World Economic Forum because there's a lot of interesting things they put forward. Some visions are extremely optimistic, but it's a case in point of how difficult it is to actually pinpoint and put a finger on this. And when a final decision has to be made, a lot of people can be misled by even or entities such as this.
Yeah.
Um,
Look,
that
look at this variable. Brazil is not bad.
No, Brazil's not bad. This points to a lot of risks, and many of those are much more frequent in other areas of the world, other than South America, for example.
Mhm.
But there are environmental risks that affect many countries. For example, biodiversity loss is a significant risk for many
What does
countries.
it mean exactly, this item? I don't know.
For example, if you have a lot of deforestation, you will lose the biodiversity that's involved in a forest, and that's important to develop the agricultural sector and to
Okay.
develop everything from uh, products that you use on the agricultural sector to
Mhm.
medicines and so on. So this is a potential curtailment of the potential of a country.
Mhm.
Extreme weather is something else. In the Gulf of Mexico, hurricanes or typhoons in Southeast Asia. But biodiversity is a problem. And for example, when we're talking, we spoke about this before, biofuels depend on large agricultural areas to grow crops that can be turned into energy. But those crops also depend on genetic improvement that you will devise, not just in the laboratory. Not everything comes from the laboratory. The
Mhm.
laboratory originally brings in biodiversity from which to choose, uh, and that is where the laboratory gets its basic information. So that's an important potential to develop into the energy powerhouse that Brazil, the U.S. is, and corn ethanol that other countries can also develop in Southeast Asia in oils, for example. Uh,
Uh-huh.
but I just wanted to show that it's very difficult to have one entity that correctly identifies everything. You have
Yeah,
to base your concern in several stories.
that's right.
But I bring together a long list because we talked about rule of law and the legal security built over several years of functioning, the legal framework, even the basic laws of the country, um, the Constitution. Those things are important. Many people are rightly very admiring of the U.S. Constitution, simple and so on, but it had many changes over time. And they look at the Brazilian Constitution, which is a giant piece of legislation that's fundamental and foundational. and they say, oh, that's very complete, but it has lots of problems. So the legal framework is very difficult to say is good or is bad. It has good aspects and it has bad aspects. It may have good aspects in terms of protection for the environment or social protections. It may have bad protections for business, for companies doing business, for example. And then you have specific legislation. For example, the oil and gas industry that we look at, there's legislation, and infra legislation would be the regulation. In both cases, usually they do not go hand in hand, because legislation is very ample and so on. And when you get down to the details, that's where the problems begin to arise. And
please let me
all of that comes into it.
yeah, let me interrupt you because
Yeah.
there is a interesting question comment.
Yeah, open-ended. Well, enough has been done. I don't think we can ever say that enough will have been done, but most countries, even Western Europe and so on, have legislation in place that can be improved a lot, especially, as you said, Cavagna, when we deal with new energies, renewable energies and so on. We don't have a history of 25 years of that in place to be able to judge whether that is sufficient or not. So climate action failure, which has been identified, for example, is a problem in many countries, because that might actually affect the day-to-day people in the country and living conditions.
Could you please explore a little bit more the climate action failure? What probably
ever since COPs and so on, and the decision to try to limit global warming, the idea is that if we have climate action, we can prevent a lot of the problems from extreme weather events due to warming conditions and so on. If we take that as science, which many people do, and there are some that question that, if we take that as fact, then climate action failure is a problem, because especially Bangladesh, for example, low-lying country, if climate action failure is what is happening, then you have a problem for the whole country. Entire cities might be swallowed up, even if they're not, because that might happen 50 years from now. They might be exposed to extreme weather events that we did not have before. And if you're talking an oil and gas company, for example, offshore operations tend to be more amenable than onshore, especially in more risky countries. But if you're talking about extreme weather events, now offshore is a potential area where those events could be more extreme. We're talking the southern tip of Africa and South Africa, where there is high oil potential. That is a problem, because those conditions are very rough. If we foresee stronger storms, then climate action failure could be a problem for the industry, raising costs a lot in order to deal with it.
Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, price controls. I like to talk about this because I'm in Brazil. You are. We are familiar with price controls and the disastrous effects that they have had in the past. That goes a little bit with consumer protections, because oftentimes demagogues confuse people and say, "Oh, I'm implementing price controls to protect the consumer," and it's actually doing the opposite. But price controls are the kind of history of action by regulatory entities that should be very worrisome. They're very costly to the operating companies, and unfortunately, no one wins, everybody loses, and people forget the lessons, but that happens over and over. Labor laws, the same thing, very protective labor laws, very harsh laws, regulations for firing people and so on. They're held out as protections for employees, but they just destroy the competitiveness of the country. The banking system, likewise, if you have a strong banking system, because of regulatory framework for the banking system, that is positive because you operate in the country, you want to be able to work with the banking system.
Yeah.
But the whole thing affects the country competitiveness. If there's an attractive opportunity to do business, even in a not well considered country, if it's not competitive, it will not be a good decision because a very geologically favorable opportunity in a small West African country, for example, if it's not competitive in other ways, you won't be able to attract employees to conduct business well and so on. And of course, regulations that affect day-to-day activities. This is the red tape part. This is a big portion of the problems that many countries have when they say this is the country cost, like the cost of doing business in the country, oftentimes associated with a lot of red tape. This is the case in Brazil, very costly red tape in Brazil.
Yeah.
But we see that is not unique. Many countries have extreme red tape. You go to the Middle East and so on. It's harrowing. And then we talk about international relations because a country may have an attractive opportunity for investment, but if it has,
at this time, Brazil is not in a good point. It's a weak point.
Well, exactly. I mean, Russia isn't either. So you have to say there's some extremes, but you look at who are you, if you plan to invest in a country, where is that country shaking hands with? And that is a concern because then you might say, hey, those are not the best company to keep in terms of international.
Like Venezuela in this case, you are talking about.
Yeah, this is a particular problem for the BRICS, for example, because even though Brazil is there, India and so on, they are all subject to that problem because they have decided to ally themselves with problematical countries. And as long as that is the case, there is a glass ceiling to the potential of the BRICS. And you and I spoke about BRICS and potential. I think at that time it looked maybe a little better, but things have maybe a top side in part because of this. The international partners of the BRICS are not top level. And then public policy regarding investment, international transactions, foreign exchange. This is critical. We are very much aware of this because many of the countries in Latin America have a long history of implementing and releasing foreign exchange controls, especially as their reserves go up and down. This is very harmful to investment because the investor doesn't know when he could get his money out. That is, a key thing. And then I think if we go back and look at what is it that we're talking about in terms of investments, there are some investments that you can say are very short term. Very few are going to be 2 years. Obviously, very opportunistic.
Most in the energy sector, that's not common.
Medium to long term. The oil and gas industry, you're definitely talking long term. If it's long term, then the relative attractiveness of different countries is a big thing because you have to keep in mind that those things can change, and if they are likely to change in a negative way over that time frame, then you are exposed to a higher risk. So there is a nice work by a colleague of mine, that a while back when Venezuela was as basket a case as it is now, and was in 2002, I think. He compared the relative geological favorability for oil and gas discoveries and operating companies making discoveries. And even at that time, he said, well, there's very attractive opportunities in Venezuela, there are attractive opportunities in Africa, but both have very unattractive long-term security risks. And that makes for more, that compensates the relative attractiveness from a geological standpoint, and you have to overcome that and say if the play is very attractive but the country is risky, you just can't take it up. And so it's a multi dimensional type of decision that you have to entertain.
Yeah.
And it's not easy. I actually feel very bad for a lot of CEOs that make decisions. Although I don't feel bad for some of them, like the old CEOs at BP and all others that invested in Russian LNG projects when I was saying, hey, that's very risky. And they put their shareholders' money into it. And indeed, what was very risky did happen. They lost their money moving out. And this is where LNG was very attractive, but the operating environment wasn't. So we have to be very conscious of that. And nowadays, I think that CEOs are more subject to compensation that has a longer term view, so that if they make a bad decision, they'll pay for it in compensation. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, you and I have spoken a couple of times about Brazil, Africa in general, Argentina, Mexico. In Mexico, I don't want to say very bad things, but they have nothing but bad news in terms of all of this changing back and forth of the attraction of investment for the oil and gas industry, which was desperate for investment, and they just spoiled everything. So that shows you how investors are anxious to enter the country, but when they see what they did over the last 4 or 5 years.
But in the case of Mexico, they make something strange, very close to us. They make a rupture with Canada and the United States very soon.
Yeah, and so you say, what are they thinking of? It beats me. I don't know what they're thinking of, but they're certainly scaring away investors. Now, you can say that in Nigeria, you can compensate some of that because of the very, very favorable business terms under which they offer some of their plays to foreign investors. So the foreign investor might say, well, I'm going to make so much more money by investing, well, maybe Nigeria and other countries in Africa, but you're going to make so much more money because the terms are more favorable. The royalties are less, the taxes are less. You're able to get more money out earlier and so on. If that is the case, you're able to compensate some of the risk. Yeah. But if the terms of the investment don't provide for very favorable terms, then you're back to balancing it.
And in terms of Argentina, it's becoming better each day. So
it's becoming better. But looking back is the problem. Because, 2015 liberalized, 2017 implemented again, 2019 released again. So, hey, where are we going to go? Maybe next year, Milei or whatever are going to change their minds again. And they say, oh, no, you can't take money out anymore.
Stability,
That is the question. And, I'm very sorry to bring up Argentina in that sense, but, it's a prime example. The recent move sounds like a good direction, but there's no substance. There's no reliability in that. Brazil, we've talked about a lot. Unfortunately, it has good and bad points, but, it's still relatively
reasonable. It's not so bad.
The best part is the oil and gas industry is operating under regulatory and legislative system, which has been there for more than 2 decades.
Christian, look at this comment from Christian. It's interesting.
Yes. When we talk about oil and gas companies, they say, "Oh, we feel so sorry for them because their success rate is only 30% or less." Sure, it's difficult dealing with geology and making a discovery, but it's even more difficult dealing with governments and indeed slippery governments. And we've had many experiences. I've had personal experiences with honest government employees who were advising companies, and the companies had just come from experiences in countries where they were basically put up against the wall and say, hey, we'd love to welcome you. You have to provide a villa in Switzerland and provide an airplane for our president and that kind of stuff. And, that takes a lot of people by surprise, because even nowadays, most, majors are not even closely
we, we,
deal with corruption, but when it comes
yeah,
to their doorstep, it's
we could say about Venezuela, it's a good geology, but at the other side, a very unstable process. And
yes. I was a consultant there in 2003, and I faced that firsthand because I was called in for a particular job at the refineries. And when you get there, you see the situation is slightly different. And the company that hired me was held up, basically for
yeah,
ransom. That is a very
yeah.
nefarious situation.
Professor, let me go back to this chart. That's very impressive for me. Very, very impressive. So United States is a light color compared
Yeah,
to,
okay. We have to say that this shows how important it is to have a multi-dimensional view of regulatory and legislative environments because you have to have many things in place. ESG is actually relatively comprehensive, but you go beyond this, the red tape factor and so on. Yes. And I want to say one thing, even though red tape is a big problem in many South American countries, there was a poll in 2018 at the height of the Argentine problems that said that only 18% of companies, the firms operating in Argentina, thought that the excessive red tape was a detriment to their business. So you say when foreign investors are looking at the country, they're scared. But when operators in the country get used to things, they get accustomed to it. And so they may get accustomed and say that's not so bad. So this is a multifaceted, multidimensional type of view that is not easy, but we need it.
yeah. My last point. Okay, let me remove because I have a last question for you. Are you prepared for the debate today, United States debate?
We'll see.
What can happen if Republicans win or wins or
Well, we had a
Democrats
program
win?
where we talked about that. I think we're back to the same point, but in this case, that I think it's even more important and differentiated. I'm not prepared to talk about it now, but after the debate, I will be able to comment more. It's
Do you
very,
suppose that they
very
have
different
questions
scenario.
about energy and regulation? No, no, they are
We
not.
surely will. We'll have a question. And you see, as it stands now, investors, even in the United States, many Western European countries are investing in the U.S., especially in renewable energy. They want to know what will be the environmental and regulatory environment for wind energy, for example. Are we going or not? And that will not be settled at the debate. It may not even be settled at the election, unfortunately.
Okay, okay, okay. Fantastic. Thank you so
Oh,
much. Was a great conversation. Please keep on the
yeah.
screen because it takes a little bit to close our
Okay, it was
video.
nice
Thank you so
talking.
much. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye.